Hey everyone, Z-Slayer Dre here, and today I'll be reviewing Final Fantasy VII Remake, developed and published by Square Enix. I don't think I can properly state just how important the original Final Fantasy VII was to gaming as a whole. With its in-depth cutscenes and strong focus on narrative, it was truly ahead of its time and paved the way for storytelling in gaming for years to come. Not to mention it had a diverse and likable cast of characters that have become beloved to fans who have found and enjoyed the game over the past 2 decades. When you have a game that is so important to gaming history and beloved by fans, it's a very fine line you have to walk when making a remake. Obviously, gaming has come a long way in the 23 years since Final Fantasy VII's release, so there was a ton of potential improvements that could be made that would enhance the remake and allow fans to fall in love with it again. Unfortunately, it seems like Final Fantasy VII Remake went through development hell, and at one point was in such a bad state that the development had to be taken away from the third-party studio working on it and moved to an internal Square development team. Furthermore, it was then announced that the remake would only consist of the Midgar section of the game, which makes up only about a third of the total story. This at best is misleading, at worst is false advertising, because nowhere on the box does it say Part 1 or Episode 1 and seems to be an attempt to make people think it's actually a complete Final Fantasy VII remake. To try and appease people and make it seem like they were not getting ripped off, Square decided to add in a bunch of new side content to stretch out the playtime. This strategy had the potential for absolute disaster, so now let's take a look and see if Square was able to recapture the magic that was Final Fantasy VII. Let's start off things with presentation, because this is one area they absolutely nailed. Surprisingly, both Midgar and characters looked exactly how I personally imagined they would in a modern setting. It has a very realistic tone to it, and it's probably one of the best looking games graphically to date in some areas. I played the original game only a few years ago, so I hold no nostalgia for it, but I have to imagine people who played it when it came out had to have been blown away by seeing Cloud, Aerith, Tifa, and friends looking like actual people instead of being only a few polygons. Midgar looks industrial, colorless, and dirty, which is exactly how it should look. Usually you want to see variation in a game's color palette, but what Square did with 7 Remake absolutely worked to properly portray Midgar. It's an industrial city with a corporation controlling everyone's lives, with many people living in absolute poverty. The bland colors actually helped build this narrative and stylistically fit perfectly with the themes of the story. However, it should be mentioned that this is again only a third of the original game, and we should have been able to see a wide variety of locations, and this is something I'll talk more about later in the review. At the very least, Square was able to present Midgar and the characters properly, and in this sense, Final Fantasy VII Remake absolutely lived up to the hype. Moving on to music and sound, while there were some positive aspects, a few areas were troublesome. Overall, the music was very well done, most returning themes were well made, and I even found some of them stuck in my head. The real issue I had was not necessarily with the quality of the music, but rather that at times the tone of the music just not fit with what was happening with the story. It didn't happen often, but when it did, it stuck out like a sore thumb and made those particular scenes extremely awkward. But that was only a few times. Usually the music just fit very well in the background and was an overall pleasant experience. Some of the returning songs did not age well and again felt out of place, but nothing so bad that it ruined the experience. When it comes to sound design, it was mostly fine, but I do have a lot to say on the voice acting, but I want to go over the story first before we get into that. So as I said earlier, Final Fantasy VII Remake is only roughly about 1/3 of the story from the original game, which could have led to potentially disastrous problems. And unfortunately it did. The basic overview is that you're a mercenary named Cloud who is joining an eco-terrorist group known as Avalanche on their mission against an evil corporation named Shinra. Shinra is draining the planet of its natural resource named Mako and is using it to fuel their power plants, which will lead to a disastrous effect on the planet's ecosystem. Cloud is an ex-soldier who worked for Shinra and was childhood friends with Tifa, a member of Avalanche. As I'm reading the script, wow, this sounds like a amazing setup for a story, and it was. In the original game, it was, for the time, such a good story and just really great story beats. Sorry, I just had to add that in. You start the game off assaulting a Shinra power plant along with Jesse, Barrett, Biggs, and Wedge, just like in the original game. Back in the day, this was one of the best openings in any game, and for the most part, the remake does a great job at recreating the excitement of the original game's intro. Unfortunately, problems almost immediately arise due to the combat, but I'll go over that later in the review. While the basic structure of the original story is mostly intact, a lot of things have been changed in order to expand around 8 hours of content into 30 to 35, depending on how many side quests you do. In some cases, this is a good thing, as some characters are fleshed out much better in the remake than the original. Jesse, Biggs, and Wedge all have additional background to the characters, which is mostly well done. Unfortunately, Wedge is basically just a walking fat joke that provides no humor or substance to the story, but there are a few moments where he does get to shine throughout the remake. They did a much better job with Jesse and Biggs, and I actually found myself enjoying their characters much more this time around. Tifa, Cloud, and Barrett are, for the most part, what I expected, and I do think their characters were well done, as not much was changed about them except for a few superficial things. After bombing the reactor, the group has to split up, and this is when Cloud runs into one of the other main characters of the story, Aerith. For the most part, this scene was well done, and not much was really changed from the original game. Sadly, this is where any possible praise I could give the game ends. After the initial opening scene, the game is a complete and utter jumbled mess that screams "designed by committee." I can understand that they wanted to extend the game out to make people feel like they were getting their money's worth. However, they could have easily done this by, I don't know, releasing the entire game instead of making only a third of it. While I do agree that some areas need to be fleshed out more, outside of a few instances, it was done in the worst way imaginable. Most of the extension of the story is through side quests, which were an absolute slog, and practically every quest was either a fetch quest or go to area and kill X amount of things quest. It was mind-numbingly boring and did nothing to enhance the story and did not add in anything meaningful. At other times, they extended out the game by just adding in long, monotonous sections, making it take longer to get to a plot point for no reason. Almost everything was just one long corridor, and even when you do go outside, everything is again just narrow, straight paths with some small openings for boss fights. Now, this is fine because usually in a Final Fantasy game, you have your earlier levels that are usually somewhat linear, and then as the game progresses, you eventually leads to a open world area. But when you only get a third of the game, you only have the linear parts, which doesn't work. Wall Market was a particularly notable failure, and if I had been playing the game for enjoyment, I would have shut it off then and never turned it back on. Again, this section is extended to the breaking point with pointless, monotonous fetch quests, and the one quest that wasn't was an arena battle. Oh, an arena battle, that sounds exciting, right? Nope, it's just a few quick fights followed by an insanely long, yet easy boss fight against Hell House. Even if it had had half the HP, it still would have been way too much, and the plot reasons for fighting it were rage-inducingly stupid. Speaking of things that are rage-inducingly stupid, let's talk about the dialogue. Or at least what I think was dialogue, as I don't think I've ever heard a human speak quite in the way that the Final Fantasy VII Remake dialogue was written. I know translating Japanese to English is difficult, but that's not an excuse for how pitifully written this game is. Remember Aerith? You know, a beloved character from Final Fantasy series who charms people over with her sincerity and kindness. She's a bumbling buffoon, rambling utter nonsense at the best of times, and at the worst, incoherent dribble. She went from a character that I personally enjoyed in the original to being someone that I absolutely could not stand at all. This issue was driven into the ground by the absolutely horrendous voice acting. I've heard some bad voice acting in my years of playing games, but this ranks near the top.
Excuse me. Hey, wait a minute. Did Johnny forget to give you my message?
The one asking me to stay put? No, I got it. I was worried about you.
Who knows what they'll ask you to do in this audition? No way in hell I'll let you go in there by yourself.
By myself? Oh, don't worry. I wasn't gonna. Come on, you'll see.
See what, exactly?
According to Madam M, you've caught the eye of a certain fabulous someone, and they'd like to meet in person.
I mean, this is basically Resident Evil 1 level bad, just with better quality recording. Or maybe it was a stylistic choice by the game's director, an attempt to make her one of the least likable characters in gaming history. While there are a few other really bad voice acting performances in the remake, none are quite this bad. Most, thankfully, are at least passable, and I probably wouldn't have said much if it wasn't for Aerith's voice acting. The same can't be said about the writing, though, as it's absolutely atrocious in every area of the game, from the dialogue to the horrifically stupid changes that make bad fan fictions look good. Now, there are a few good moments in the game because it does keep some of the original structure from the original. Outside of that, everything new that was added in is almost universally bad. It's so poorly written that I don't think it's possible to understand what's going on in the story unless you've played the original game. Quite a few things are never explained, and there seems to be no in-universe rules, so completely random things happen. I could honestly go on all day about how poorly designed this game is from a story standpoint, but I'm going to have to stop myself here because I don't even want to think about it anymore. When it comes to combat, they also completely ruined that as well. I have no answer as to why they had to change it from turn-based combat to real-time action combat. Games like Dragon Quest XI and Yakuza Like a Dragon show us how successful turn-based combat can still be, and how much fun it can still be to play as well. And yes, real-time combat could have been an amazing change if done properly, but that's not the case here. Combat is extremely simplistic, as you basically just mash the one attack button, which then builds up a meter. The meter then can be spent on any action ranging from combat move to spells to an item. There's also blocking, although unless you use materia to improve it, it's basically useless, and then there's dodging, but that is useless. I found it more beneficial just to run from attacks than to actually use a dodge button, as since almost every enemy attack locks onto you and the dodge does nothing to mitigate the damage, like in any other game. And not to mention, the camera is basically non-functional. I'm basically out of adjectives to describe how horrible things are at this point. There were times where I literally could not see what was happening because the camera was behind a pillar, or even in an open area, it would just be stuck behind something. I can't believe how bad it is. I really can't believe how some of the aspects of this game got through QA. I mean, I don't even know if there was any, to be perfectly honest. It is so bad. So this leads to an incredibly dull experience where you just mash your attack button, then select a move from a menu, then rinse and repeat. Enemies mostly have ridiculously high HP, so you'd be mashing away on them for quite some time. The only other real mechanic is a stagger meter, which is nothing we haven't seen before. Each enemy has certain types of attacks that they are vulnerable to, which will increase the stagger meter by a greater amount than regular attacks. So the combat boils down to just mashing one button and spamming whichever attack is best to increase the stagger meter. There's almost no strategy to it, and I can't think of any game with simpler combat. It's pretty clear at this point Square Enix is physically incapable of making a good real-time action combat system, as they've failed numerous times at this point to do so. I'm sorry, I think I've said enough. This was one of the least enjoyable gaming experiences I've ever had, and I would not have finished the game if I wasn't reviewing it. The ending was something out of a 3-year-old's imagination, and I'm afraid I might be insulting the intelligence of 3-year-olds by saying that. Ultimately, there is no reason for this remake to exist outside of the insatiable greed of Square Enix executives. Nothing sums up the gaming industry today better than 23 years ago. We get a full game that's imaginative and inventive, and now we get a third of one that is a jumbled mess. Square Enix is walking on very shaky ground right now, and clearly there's some real issues from the top down. I mean, after this game and Marvel's Avengers, clearly something needs to change in their company. As for the other 2/3 of the game that's missing, I think they should either cancel it entirely or start from scratch with a completely new team, as the team that made this remake should not have jobs in the gaming industry. Either they don't care about the quality of their work, or they're incapable of producing anything of value, and I'm not really sure which is worse. I'm going to give Final Fantasy VII Remake a 4 out of 10. And I can't recommend anyone play this game, even die-hard Final Fantasy fans. The only reason I'm not going lower is that it meets the barest of bare minimum requirements to be considered a video game, like turning on, and it does contain some great plot points and characters from the original, even though they were completely ruined in the process. I feel so bad for fans that have been waiting so long to get a remake of a beloved game from their childhood. At this point, I wouldn't expect anything from Square Enix anymore, and I would probably declare the death of Final Fantasy if it wasn't for Final Fantasy XIV still going quite strong. Jeez, I'm sorry for being such a downer. This is not what I expected this game to be. I was looking forward to reviewing this game. I missed out on when it released, and I was actually excited to play it. And I had no idea what I was in for. But I'm hoping that I can help someone somewhere from wasting their money. But anyways, if you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and consider subscribing. I still have a few more reviews to do from 2020, so be on the lookout for those. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.